It was meant to be a routine winter patrol across a steel-gray sea, nothing more than another quiet shift logged by the Coast Guard. But beneath the rolling waves and frozen wind, someone was listening, and someone had already decided that the officer on that patrol boat would never return to shore. When a former veteran and his German shepherd sensed what the radio refused to reveal, a carefully staged accident began to crack apart. Marked for silence and hunted under the cover of the ocean's chaos, she had only moments before the truth was drowned with her. As loyalty was tested in the cold and darkness closed in, one veteran, one dog, and one choice stood between justice and a lie meant to vanish forever. If you believe God still protects His children, comment Amen below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and quiet miracles. Winter pressed down on the North Atlantic like cold iron, turning the sea to slate and the wind to a blade. Jack Turner lived where most men only visited, at the edge of the harbor lights, on a weather-beaten wooden boat that creaked like an old confession every time the tide changed. At 41, Jack had the build of a man who once carried too much for too long, tall, broad through the shoulders, the kind of strength that didn't pose for photographs anymore. The service had left him with a slightly uneven posture, as if one shoulder remembered a weight the other refused to admit. On damp mornings, the joint tightened first, announcing the day before the sunrise did. His face was sharp in the way winter cliffs were sharp straight nose, squared cheekbones, a jaw that looked carved rather than grown, and a short beard that never quite decided if it was neglect or intention. Dark hair, clipped close on the sides, lay a little longer on top, salt beginning to thread through it like the sea's first claim on him. People at the docks said Jack was polite but distant, the man who paid cash, spoke in full sentences, and never asked the sort of questions that led to friendships. They weren't wrong. Jack's quiet was not shyness. It was a dam. Years ago, a misread signal in a faraway theater, one bad assumption, 1 second too late, had cost men he still heard when the world went silent. Since then, he treated noise like it could betray you, and silence like it might save you, if you listened hard enough. He wore a scuffed brown leather jacket that had survived more winters than most marriages, and beneath it, a red and black plaid flannel showed at the collar and cuffs, stubborn color against gray water, like a campfire ember that refused to die. Beside him moved Shadow, a 4-year-old German shepherd with a black and tan coat thick enough to shrug off ice and a chest like a small barricade. Shadow was big for the breed, not oversized in a clumsy way, but powerful built like an athlete who knew exactly why he trained. His amber eyes carried the steady intelligence that made strangers lower their voices without knowing why. Jack didn't talk to Shadow the way some men talk to dogs, as if they were props for loneliness. He talked to him the way you talk to someone who had earned a seat at the table. Shadow had been trained once, properly, back when Jack still believed that structure could keep the world from falling apart. The commands had faded into habit, but the discipline remained, refined into instinct. When Shadow stood, it wasn't with frantic alertness, it was with judgment, like a sentinel in fur who had read too many bad outcomes. Tonight, the weather turned nastier, wind rising, sleet spitting sideways, so Jack brought the boat into Greyhaven Harbor, a working port town that smelled of diesel, salt, and fried fish, the holy trinity of places where secrets thought they could blend in. The docks were busy in that winter way. Fewer tourists, more men who didn't smile, more cargo moved in the dark. Jack tied off, checked his lines twice, then once more because superstition was just experience wearing a cheap hat. Shadow hopped down onto the planks and shook, sending a spray of ice crystals into the air like a dog-sized snow globe. Jack snorted once at the theatrics. Shadow always did that shake as if the ocean had insulted him personally, and the corner of his mouth threatened a smile before discipline put it back in its cage. They headed toward the bait shop and the attached dockside cafe where the heater worked only if you sat close enough to argue with it. Inside, the room was small and bright with cheap light, its windows fogged by breath and boiling chowder. A few fishermen hunched over coffee, their hands cracked and red from rope and cold. An old radio murmured weather warnings in a bored voice, like the sky itself had paperwork. The woman behind the counter, Linda, late 50s, hair bleached blonde and pinned up as if she refused to let time win, nodded at Jack with a practiced neutrality that meant she'd seen too much to be surprised by anything. She liked Shadow, though, and slipped him a scrap of bacon when she thought no one was watching. Shadow accepted it with dignified restraint, tail barely thumping once, as if acknowledging tribute from a village elder. Jack ordered black coffee and a bowl of chowder he didn't need, paid without fuss, and took the corner seat where he could see the door and the windows and the narrow hallway that led to the restroom. Old habits weren't scars, they were maps. As he ate, he watched the harbor through the fogged glass, lights bobbing, cranes looming like skeletal gods, and beyond them the sea, dark and patient, waiting for something to fall into it. The storm was coming in earnest now, the kind that made fishermen swear and insurance adjusters rub their hands. That should have been the only danger on the schedule. Then two men entered, bringing a draft of colder air and the faint scent of expensive cologne that didn't belong on a dock. They weren't locals. Locals wore their years. These two wore their confidence. The first, a lean man in his late 30s, had a narrow face and hair gelled into place like he'd just left a mirror with instructions. He moved with that smooth, unhurried stride of someone who believed doors opened for him even when they didn't. His eyes were pale gray or washed-out blue, and they flicked around the room as if counting cameras, exits, and witnesses in the same breath. The second was heavier, early 40s, stocky with a thick neck and a beard that tried to look rugged but landed closer to lazy. He wore a black parka that still held its factory creases, and his boots were too clean for someone who claimed the sea as a workplace. His hands, though, told a truth his clothes couldn't hide. The knuckles were scarred, the fingers thick with old impact. Violence had lived there once, and it hadn't moved out. They spoke low at the counter, then took a table near the hallway, backs half turned to the room, like they wanted privacy without leaving public space, a common mistake among men who thought intimidation was camouflage. Jack didn't stare. He didn't need to. He listened the way he'd learned to listen overseas, when a sentence half heard could mean the difference between walking away and being carried. Shadow lay down at Jack's feet, head on pause, but his ears rotated subtly, tracking the new voices like radar. The lean man said something Jack couldn't catch. Then the stocky one laughed under his breath, a sound without humor. "Storm's perfect," the stocky man muttered. "Everybody'll blame the water." Jack's spoon paused. Linda clinked dishes. The radio mumbled. The world tried to pretend it hadn't heard. The lean man leaned closer, voice dropping another notch. "You sure she's on patrol tonight?" he asked. "Yeah," the stocky man answered. "Officer, what's her name? Carter. Coast Unit. She's been snooping. Thinks she's a hero." He said hero like it was a disease. Jack felt something old and sour stir under his ribs, not anger, not fear, but recognition. The lean man tapped the table twice, impatient. "We can't afford her mouth," he said. "Not with customs and our people lined up. If she talks, it's not just a bust, it's a chain." The stocky man's beard lifted with his grin. "She won't talk," he said. "Not after tonight." Jack's gaze stayed on his bowl, but his hearing sharpened until even the heater's rattle sounded like a warning. The lean man asked, "And the boat?" The stocky man replied, "Patrol Kano's going out past the breakwater. We'll make it look like a collision. Rogue skiff, no lights, bad visibility. Add a mayday that cuts out. Ocean eats the rest. People love a clean story." He said it like he was describing a recipe. Jack's jaw tightened, the old scar in his memory itching. Bodies found days later, explanations filed neatly, questions buried under bureaucracy and fatigue. The lean man exhaled, satisfied. "She'll be silent," he said, almost reverent. "Forever." Shadow's head lifted a fraction, not because he understood words, but because he understood the shape of intent. His amber eyes fixed on the hallway table with a steady, unblinking stare that made the stocky man glance around uneasily. The lean man followed his look, then spotted Shadow and frowned. Jack didn't move, but he placed his hand lightly on Shadow's shoulders, a quiet command. Hold. Shadow held. The lean man looked away first, as if the dog's gaze had reminded him that some witnesses didn't need a badge to be credible. The two men finished their coffee too fast, murmured something to Linda that sounded like a complaint about weather, and left. The bell above the door jingled cheerfully, betraying no awareness of the ugly plan that had just walked out into the storm. Jack sat very still. Inside him, two instincts argued like old brothers, the one that wanted to keep his head down, keep his boat safe, keep the world's trouble from hooking into his life again, and the other, the one that had never actually retired, that saw a woman's name being erased in advance and refused to let the sea be used as an accomplice. Jack had tried for years to live like a man who was done choosing, but the truth about choices was cruel. You didn't stop making them. You just started making them quietly. He looked down at Shadow, who stared back with a calm that felt almost human, as if saying, "Well?" Jack exhaled, a thin fog of breath in the cafe's warm air. Somewhere out there, beyond the fogged windows and the cranes and the breakwater, a patrol boat was preparing for its shift, and a woman was about to step into a night that had already been scripted for her funeral. Jack pushed his bowl away untouched, stood, and slipped on his gloves with the slow care of a man loading responsibility into his hands. He paid Linda, left a larger tip than usual, an apology in advance, and walked out into the wind with Shadow at his heel. The harbor lights wavered on the black water like nervous prayers. Jack tightened his leather jacket against the cold, felt the old shoulder complain, and listened to the storm the way you listen to a warning from an ancient god. Not a routine night, he murmured to no one. Shadow sneezed once, sharp and judgmental, as if agreeing that the ocean had terrible timing. Jack didn't laugh, but something in him warmed anyway, because if the night was going to hunt, then it wouldn't hunt unopposed. Winter tightened its grip along the coast as Emily Carter stood alone on the pier, the wind needling through her uniform and carrying the sharp tang of salt and diesel. At 33, Emily had the kind of presence that didn't ask for attention, but earned it anyway. She was of average height, compact rather than slight, her strength built from long hours on rolling decks instead of any gym routine. Her winter patrol jacket fit close at the shoulders, worn smooth at the cuffs where gloved hands had rubbed the fabric thin. Dark blonde hair was pulled back into a low ponytail that brushed the collar of her coat, practical and unadorned, though a few loose strands always escaped to frame her face. Her skin was pale from winter light and night shifts, freckled faintly across the bridge of her nose, and her eyes, clear, disciplined, blue, missed very little. People who worked with Emily described her as quiet but relentless, the kind of officer who didn't raise her voice and didn't need to. She had learned early that confidence spoken too loudly invited opposition, while quiet persistence slipped under doors unnoticed. 2 years earlier, that persistence had been shaken by a single mistake. She had trusted a report that said backup was en route, and a witness had died waiting. Since then, Emily treated every official assurance like glass useful, but never to be leaned on. Her patrol boat, a sleek Coast Guard cano named Seabird, rocked gently against the dock as she checked her gear with methodical calm. She moved through her routine with muscle memory. Fuel levels, emergency flares, radio frequencies, GPS calibration. Everything appeared normal, and that, more than anything, unsettled her. For months, Emily had been chasing inconsistencies that refused to line up neatly. Containers logged as empty that weighed too much. Customs stamps that appeared after midnight when the offices were supposedly dark. AIS data that glitched always in the same corridors of water, as if the sea itself had been instructed to look away. On paper, each anomaly could be explained away. Together, they formed a pattern that pulsed like an infection under the skin. Emily had begun to call it the stain. She didn't say the word out loud, not even in her own reports. She wrote irregularities, clerical discrepancies, signal interference. But in her mind, The stains spread outward from a handful of shipping lanes like spilled oil, touching ports, manifests, and finally people. One of those people was Richard Hale, a senior customs official whose name surfaced too often near expedited clearances. Hale was in his late 50s, tall and smooth-faced, with silver hair combed back carefully and a voice that carried the reassuring weight of authority. He smiled easily, shook hands firmly, and spoke about streamlining maritime commerce with the practiced warmth of a man who expected to be trusted. Emily didn't trust him. Trust, she'd learned, was earned in what people overlooked, not in what they displayed. Another name appeared less frequently, but left deeper marks. Deputy Chief Martin Cole of Coastal Operations, a man with a reputation for efficiency and loyalty to the chain of command. Cole was broad-shouldered, his hair cut regulation short, his face weathered into permanent lines that suggested both discipline and impatience. He had mentored Emily briefly when she transferred to maritime patrol, praising her diligence while cautioning her against overreach. That word lingered with her now, like a threat disguised as advice. Tonight's patrol was routine by design. Emily had filed a standard route plan, hugging the outer shipping lanes where storms scared away pleasure craft and left only commercial traffic and the occasional fishing vessel. She suspected someone wanted her out there, not close enough to shore to draw attention, not far enough to vanish without a story. As she cast off, the harbor lights blurred behind her, and the Seabird slipped into darker water, its engine a steady hum beneath the wind. Emily adjusted her headset and checked in with dispatch. Static answered first, then a thin acknowledgement that felt delayed by a fraction too long. She frowned, but logged it as interference from the weather. The ocean didn't care about her suspicions. It rolled on, gray and heavy, waves slapping the hull with a rhythm that felt almost intentional. As the shoreline receded, Emily's thoughts returned to the flash drive tucked inside her jacket, sealed in waterproof casing. It held fragments, partial logs, audio clips, timestamps that didn't quite match, but together they told a story no one wanted to hear. She hadn't shared it yet, not because she lacked courage, but because she lacked certainty about who would receive it. Corruption, she'd learned, didn't always announce itself with villains. Sometimes it wore familiar faces and offered help. The radio crackled again. This time a location pinged on her screen, a possible distress signal near the outer breakwater, weak but persistent. Emily's pulse ticked up. She checked the coordinates against her map. The spot sat just beyond the usual patrol arc, where currents twisted unpredictably around old industrial debris left to rust beneath the waves. "Dispatch, confirm source," she said evenly. The reply came wrapped in static, the words smearing together. "Signal. Intermittent. Investigate." Emily stared at the screen longer than protocol required. A familiar unease crept up her spine, the same sensation she'd ignored once before. She considered logging the anomaly and returning to port. She considered calling for another unit. Both options felt wrong in different ways. If someone truly needed help, delay could kill them. If someone wanted her isolated, bringing backup might only widen the net. She chose the lesser of two risks: action. The Seabird cut through the waves, spray icing along the rails as the temperature dropped. Emily throttled back near the coordinates, scanning the dark water for flares or silhouettes. There was nothing. No lights, no debris, no sound beyond wind and engine. The radio hissed again, then fell silent. Emily's jaw tightened. She reached to adjust frequencies, cycling through channels with practiced efficiency. Each attempt brought the same result: dead air. "That's not weather," she muttered. She had just begun to turn the boat when she noticed a small craft ahead, barely visible between swells. It was an old wooden boat, its navigation lights dim, riding the waves with stubborn resilience. A man stood at the stern, tall and broad, his posture steady despite the chop. Beside him, a large German shepherd braced itself, paws wide, ears forward, a dark shape against the pale spray. Emily eased closer, spotlight cutting through the night. The man raised a hand, not waving, but signaling restraint. As the boats drew alongside, Emily caught his face in the light. Angular, bearded, eyes sharp with a watchfulness that set her instincts humming. Before she could speak, the dog stiffened, gaze locking past her toward the open water. The man leaned forward, voice low but urgent, and in a movement so controlled it startled her more than force ever could, he placed his hand gently but firmly over her mouth. His eyes held hers, not threatening, but commanding silence with the weight of experience. "Don't," he whispered. "They're listening." Emily froze, anger flaring for a heartbeat before discipline smothered it. She felt the truth of his words resonate in the dead radio pressed against her chest. The dog's presence filled the small cabin, solid and deliberate, as if the space itself had chosen sides. Outside, the sea rolled on, indifferent and complicit, and somewhere beyond the darkness, the stain Emily had been tracing began to close its fingers. The cabin of the seabird felt smaller once the doors shut, as if the winter sea had pressed its weight against the glass and decided to listen. Emily Carter stood rigid between the console and the narrow bench, every instinct trained for command, rebelling against the sudden loss of control, while Jack Turner kept his hand lightly but decisively over her mouth. It was not force that held her still, it was certainty. His palm was rough, calloused by rope and years of salt, warm despite the cold, and steady in a way that spoke of a man who had learned the cost of hesitation. His eyes, close now, were a muted hazel flecked with gold, alert without panic, the eyes of someone who had once trusted radios and learned better. Shadow filled the remaining space like a living barrier. The German shepherd's body had gone utterly still, muscles coiled beneath thick black and tan fur, ears high and forward, amber eyes locked not on Emily or Jack, but on the radio unit bolted beneath the dash. At 4 years old, Shadow was in the full confidence of his strength, large even for his breed, chest broad, neck powerful, his breath slow and controlled as if he understood the value of quiet. Emily felt her pulse hammer against Jack's hand. Anger flared, first anger at the intrusion, at the audacity, at the way her authority had been overridden in her own vessel. But anger dissolved quickly, replaced by something colder and more precise. The radio on her chest, which had moments ago felt like an anchor to order, was now dead weight. No hiss, no crackle, just silence so clean it felt manufactured. Jack leaned in until his mouth was near her ear, his voice barely shaping the air. "They're listening," he whispered. "If you speak, if you key that mic, they'll know exactly where you are." Emily didn't nod. She didn't shake her head. She did something harder. She trusted the evidence of her own senses. The dog's posture, the dead radio, the timing too perfect to be coincidence. Jack removed his hand the moment he felt her breathing steady, retreating half a step to give her space without surrendering the ground he'd claimed. Shadow didn't relax. He shifted instead, angling his body so that one shoulder blocked the door and the other shadowed the console, as if drawing an invisible line through the cabin. Emily raised one gloved finger, not in command, but in acknowledgement. Then she spoke in a whisper that barely deserved the name. "Explain," she said. Jack exhaled softly, a sound that carried equal parts relief and regret. Up close, Emily could see the details he'd worn like camouflage from a distance. The faint silver threading his beard, the crease at the corner of his eyes that came from squinting into glare, not smiling. His leather jacket was cracked at the elbows, darkened by years of use, and beneath it, the red and black plaid flannel showed like a stubborn signature. He looked like a man who didn't belong to any organization anymore, and that, she realized, was exactly why he frightened whoever was listening. "We heard them at the harbor," Jack murmured. "2 men, not locals, talking about a collision tonight, about you." Emily's jaw tightened. "Names?" she asked. Jack shook his head. "Not yet, but they talked like this wasn't their first cleanup." Shadow let out a sound so low it was more vibration than noise, his gaze flicking to the cabin window. Emily followed it and felt the hair along her arms lift. Beyond the glass, the sea rolled in heavy, dark bands. Nothing visible. And yet the feeling persisted, that sense of being observed, measured, logged. Emily reached for the radio by habit and stopped herself an inch short, fingers curling inward as if burned. Jack watched the restraint with something like respect. "Good," he said quietly. "That's how you stay alive tonight." Emily met his eyes. "You boarded a police vessel under false pretenses," she said, voice controlled. "Give me one reason not to put you back on your boat the moment this clears." Jack didn't bristle. He didn't smile. He nodded once, as if the question were fair. "Because it won't clear," he replied. "Not unless we decide how." Outside, the wind shifted, driving sleet against the hull in sharp, needling bursts. The Seabird rocked, a subtle roll that Shadow compensated for without moving his feet, adjusting like a sailor born. Emily took a breath and made a decision she would later pretend had been inevitable. "Show me," she said. Jack reached into his jacket slowly, deliberately, and withdrew a small, battered handheld receiver, the kind used by hobbyists and men who didn't trust single points of failure. Its casing was scratched, the antenna taped at the base. "Old tech," Jack whispered. "Doesn't register like yours." He turned a dial with careful precision. At first there was only static, thin and directionless. Then, faintly, a voice bled through, distorted, but unmistakably human. Emily's eyes sharpened. The voice spoke in clipped phrases, referencing coordinates that made her stomach drop. They were close, too close. Another voice cut in, smoother, carrying authority even through interference. "Hold position," it said. "Let the weather do the work." Emily felt a flash of cold clarity. That cadence. She'd heard it in briefings, in after-action reviews. Deputy Chief Martin Cole. Her hand tightened on the edge of the console, knuckles whitening. Jack saw the recognition cross her face. "You know that voice," he said. Emily nodded once. "I trained under him," she replied. "He taught me to trust the system." Shadow's ears flattened for a fraction of a second, then rose again, as if offended on her behalf. Emily swallowed. "What's your name?" she asked Jack. "Jack Turner," he said. "Former Navy." He hesitated, then added, "I stopped counting years ago." "And the dog?" "Shadow," Jack replied, and this time a hint of warmth touched his voice. "He listens better than I do." As if on cue, Shadow shifted again, head lifting, nostrils flaring. He let out a single controlled huff, an alert without sound. Jack followed the dog's gaze and stiffened. "They're moving," he said. Emily leaned toward the radar screen, adjusting brightness without speaking. A blip flickered at the edge of range, then another. Small craft. No AIS. Running dark. "If they hit us," Emily said quietly, "it'll be framed as an accident." Jack nodded. "That's the plan," he said, "unless we change the story." Emily's mind raced, stitching together fragments she'd been collecting for months. The missing containers, the altered logs, the pressure to patrol alone tonight. It was all converging here, in this cabin, in this enforced silence. "If we run," she said, "they'll chase. If we call it in—" Jack shook his head. "They'll hear," he finished, "and they'll adjust." Shadow shifted his weight, claws clicking softly against the deck, impatience threading into his stillness like a drawn wire. Emily closed her eyes for half a heartbeat and made another choice. "We don't run," she said. "We don't call. We let them think we're exactly where they want us." Jack studied her, measuring not rank but resolve. "You're suggesting bait," he said. "I'm suggesting evidence," Emily replied. "They're confident. Confident people talk." Jack's mouth curved in a humorless smile. "So do men who think the ocean will keep their secrets," he said. Emily reached into her jacket and pulled out the waterproof flash drive, holding it up briefly. "I already have pieces," she said. "I need names, voices, orders." Jack nodded slowly. "Then we give them a stage," he said. Outside, a wave struck the hull harder than the rest, sending a shudder through the cabin. Shadow braced, unshaken. "All right, we stay dark. We drift. and when they come close enough to be sure, we listen." Jack returned the receiver to his jacket and reached for the cabin light. He paused, then clicked it off, plunging them into dim blue instrument glow. "Silence," he said again, softer this time, not as a command, but as a promise. The seabird slipped into the rolling dark. 3 lives bound by a decision made without witnesses, while beyond the cabin walls the winter sea conspired to erase whatever it was given. The sea did not calm. It learned their names instead, rolling closer as if to memorize the shape of the seabird before erasing it. Jack Turner spoke low and steady, recounting the fragments he'd gathered at the harbor with the care of a man laying out evidence on a cold table. The collision would be staged, he said, an unmarked skiff running dark, its lights killed, its hull angled just enough to glance the patrol boat and shove it into the chop where winter waves did the rest. A Mayday would sputter and die, recorded as interference. By dawn, the report would read clean. Occupational accident, weather a contributing factor. He didn't embellish. The plan was ugly enough without decoration. Emily Carter listened with her hands braced on the console, the glow from the instruments carving pale lines across her face. She had the look of someone who had spent months assembling a puzzle only to discover the picture had been decided before she began. The flash drive in her jacket felt heavier now, as if it had grown teeth. "They're not trying to scare me," she said, voice flat. "They're trying to end the inquiry." Jack nodded once. "Your evidence," he said, "isn't leverage. It's a death sentence." Shadow lay across the threshold of the cabin, body stretched in a way that blocked the door without seeming aggressive, a 4-year-old German shepherd shaped by discipline and patience. His black and tan coat caught the instrument light in dull highlights, thick fur ruffled by the cabin's breath. When the boat rolled, he adjusted with small, precise movements, never lifting his head, amber eyes half-lidded yet alert. Emily felt a flicker of gratitude she didn't have time to examine. Outside, the radar showed dark water and the faint suggestion of movement beyond its comfort. Emily reached for the chart plotter and dragged a finger along the lanes she'd memorized, tracing where the collision would accidentally occur. "They'll pick a place where currents twist," she said, "where wreckage drifts wide and stories narrow." Jack leaned closer, the smell of salt and old leather filling the space. "We change the drift," he replied, "and the story." Emily straightened, resolve settling into her posture like armor. "We can't outrun them," she said. "If we run for shore, they'll intercept. If we hide, they'll wait." She glanced at Shadow, then back to Jack. "We make the accident, but on our terms." Jack's eyes narrowed, not in doubt, but calculation. He had seen plans like this collapse under the weight of courage mistaken for strategy. "Say it," he said. Emily spoke quickly, the words shaped by months of quiet preparation. "We stage the collision signs without the collision," she said. "Scrape, debris, noise. We let them think the ocean took us. Meanwhile, we listen." Jack considered the cabin, the equipment, the limits. "We'll need a second set of ears," he said. Emily nodded. "I know someone," she replied. "Not law enforcement, not customs." She hesitated, then said the name like a confession. "Sarah Lowell." Jack waited. "Marine accountant," Emily continued. "Independent auditor for port authorities. Tall, narrow-shouldered, early 40s, brown hair worn long and braided when she works so it stays out of her face. Skin like winter paper from years under fluorescent lights. She dresses plain wool coats, practical boots, and speaks like every word costs her interest. She used to be married to a shipping broker who went to prison for falsifying manifests. He took the fall. She learned how." Emily's mouth tightened. "She taught me to read numbers the way you read weather." Jack absorbed the description, the old soldier's instinct sorting allies from liabilities. "She won't panic," he said, "and she won't talk." "She already knows something's wrong," Emily replied. "She warned me to stop asking questions." Shadow's ears lifted, then settled again. The boat lurched, sleet rattling the cabin windows like thrown gravel. Jack turned to the locker beneath the bench and pulled out a coil of line and a canvas sack, moving with quiet efficiency. "We'll need sound," he said. "Metal on metal. And drift." He reached into the sack and produced a battered fender and a strip of rusted plate he'd salvaged from a derelict weeks earlier, the edges dulled. "This'll sing if you let it," he murmured. Emily watched, mind racing ahead. "They'll want proof," she said. "Debris. A timestamp." Jack's mouth curved in a thin smile. "We'll give them a mess they can't resist cleaning," he replied. "Confident men tidy up." He nodded at the radio. "And when they do, they'll talk." Emily felt the fear sharpen into focus. She keyed a private channel on her console, then stopped herself, switching to the handheld recorder clipped beneath her jacket instead. She tested it silently, watching the light blink. "I'll need plausible damage," she said. Jack nodded. "And I'll need you to trust a dog," he replied. Shadow rose at the sound of his name, unfolding into the narrow aisle with liquid grace. He was large without being clumsy, paws wide, tail low and steady. Jack knelt and fastened a small weatherproof camera to the harness beneath Shadow's chest, the lens angled forward. "You okay with this?" Jack asked Emily, not flippant, genuinely checking. The plan took shape in murmurs and gestures. They would drift into a pocket of rough water where radar ghosts multiplied. Jack would work the fender and plate against the hull at a precise angle, producing the scream of collision without the bone-breaking stop. Emily would cut the engine at the right moment, letting the Seabird yaw and roll, then bring it back under control. Shadow would go over the side briefly, tethered and safe, camera catching the chaos from water-level spray, darkness, the convincing blur of disaster. The mayday would be keyed and choked, recorded by anyone listening. Then silence. They would drift, powerless by design, and wait for the cleanup. "They'll send someone to verify," Emily said. "Someone who believes the paperwork already." Jack nodded. "And when they do," he said, "they'll speak freely." Emily felt the weight of its subtle risk, balanced on timing and trust. "If it goes wrong," she said quietly, "there's no badge that saves us." Jack met her gaze. "I know," he replied. Shadow sat, the camera blinking once like an eye that refused to close. They moved. Jack secured lines, braced himself against the rail, and gave Emily a look that meant now. She eased the Seabird into the pocket, the sea rising and falling in heavy slabs. Jack pressed the rusted plate to the hull and let the wave do the rest. The sound ripped through the night metal screaming, a lie loud enough to satisfy any ear. Emily cut the engine, the boat lurching as if struck, instruments flaring and dimming. She keyed the mic, voice steady but breathless, and let the call fracture under Jack's hand as he twisted the gain. "May!" Static swallowed the rest. Shadow went over the side with a splash. Tether snapping taut, camera catching spray and darkness and the convincing chaos of loss. Emily counted heartbeats like steps. Jack hauled Shadow back aboard, the dog shaking once, then bracing as if nothing had happened. Emily brought the engine back just enough to keep them afloat, lights dead, drift honest. They waited. Minutes stretched. The sea resumed its work, waves smoothing the lie they'd told. The receiver in Jack's jacket whispered, then spoke. Voices, closer now, confident. Emily felt a cold clarity settle. "They bought it," Jack murmured. Shadow lay back across the threshold, guardian again. Emily exhaled and let the silence hold. The Seabird drifted like a rumor that had decided to be believed, its lights dead, its hull bearing the honest scars of a lie carefully told. Emily Carter lay on the cabin floor, wrapped in a thermal blanket, face pale beneath the dim instrument glow, breathing slow and shallow by design, while Jack Turner worked the final touches of disappearance with the patience of a man who knew that truth failed when it hurried. He twisted the GPS antenna just enough to bias the fix, letting the plotted track wander like a drunk memory. He smeared salt water across a cracked housing to sell corrosion. He keyed a fractured mayday and choked it mid-syllable, then killed the power clean. Outside, the winter sea shouldered the work. waves grinding away the edges until the story felt inevitable. Shadow moved between tasks without instruction, 4-year-old muscles reading Jack's hands and Emily's breath, the German shepherd's black and tan coat slicked with spray, amber eyes bright but disciplined. The small camera at his chest blinked once and went dark as Jack covered the lens with a strip of tape to preserve battery until it mattered again. Silence settled, not empty but attentive, the kind that counted seconds. They waited long enough for confidence to bloom on the other end of the line. Jack slipped the battered receiver from his jacket and tuned by feel, fingers finding the notch where voices liked to gather. At first there was only the whisper of weather, then a practiced calm threaded through, men speaking as if the sea were a colleague that could be trusted with secrets. "Confirm debris," a smooth voice said. Richard Hale, the senior customs official whose tailored words usually arrived wrapped in reassurance. Even through distortion, his cadence was unmistakable. Late 50s, tall and immaculate, silver hair combed back as if time itself took appointments, a face that had learned to look concerned without being curious. Another voice answered, lower, clipped, the sort that had been trained to carry authority through noise. "Hull breach plausible," it said. "Weather supports narrative." Jack glanced at Emily. Her eyes were open now, steady, listening. She raised one finger weight. Hale spoke again, the faint smile audible. "Then we tidy," he said. "No heroics. Let the water finish." The phrase landed like a stamp. Jack's jaw set. He adjusted the receiver to capture the breath between words, the small human tells that paperwork never caught. Shadow's ears rotated, mapping the soundscape, then stilled as the receiver went quiet. Minutes later the cleanup arrived. A low silhouette slipped into range, running dark but sure, its engine tuned to purr rather than announce. Jack and Emily stayed where they were, bodies arranged to read as loss rather than readiness. Shadow eased to the threshold. A living hinge, camera uncovered now and recording, the lens catching the sweep of a flashlight across the seabird's rail, the crunch of boots that did not belong to fishermen. The men boarded with the confidence of ownership. One was young and careful, shoulders narrow beneath a parka too new for winter work, eyes darting as if he'd learned vigilance from watching others rather than surviving it himself. The other was older, thicker through the neck, beard threaded with gray, his movements economical in the way men moved after years of being paid to finish things. They spoke in murmurs that assumed no one was listening. "Chains intact," the older man said, tapping the GPS. "Bias reads clean." The younger nodded, swallowing. "And the officer?" "Ocean," the older replied, as if naming a co-worker. Shadow's camera caught it all, the casual cruelty, the certainty. Jack held his breath until his lungs ached, then let it go when the men left, satisfied. The skiff peeled away, its wake erasing prints like forgiveness no one had asked for. Only then did Emily sit up, muscles shaking with the release of control. "We have voices," she whispered, "and hands." Jack nodded, already sealing the receiver in its pouch. "And a window," he said. They didn't linger. Jack restarted systems in a staggered order that sold failure rather than recovery and brought the seabird to a crawl, lights still dead. They rode the drift toward a line of rocks where currents braided into confusion, then cut south under the weather's cover. An hour later, a different light answered them, steady, patient, deliberately unhelpful. Sarah Lowell stood on the lee side of a derelict pier, tall and narrow-shouldered in a charcoal wool coat that fell straight as a column, boots scuffed but cared for, a knit cap pulled low over chestnut hair braided down her back. Her skin held the pale, clean look of someone who lived under office lights and winter skies, and her eyes, hazel, precise measured distance like numbers waiting to be balanced. In her early 40s, Sarah moved with the economy of a woman who had learned to be underestimated and had decided to let that be useful. She did not wave. She did not hurry. When Jack eased the seabird alongside and cut the engine, Sarah stepped aboard with a single glance at Emily that asked a question and accepted the answer before it was spoken. "You're dead," she said quietly. Emily nodded. For the night. Sarah's mouth curved, not a smile, exactly, but recognition. Good, she replied. The ledger opens wider when it thinks no one's watching. She produced a slim laptop from beneath her coat, its casing scarred, ports taped against salt. Hale expedited 3 containers through a Shell nonprofit 2 hours ago, she said, fingers moving. The charity exists. Its books don't. Jack watched the numbers bloom and collapse, patterns emerging like tide charts. You trust this? He asked. Sarah met his gaze, unblinking. I trusted a man once, she said. He went to prison for me. I learned to trust arithmetic instead. Emily leaned in, the ache in her shoulders a dull roar she ignored. We caught his voice, she said. Sarah's eyes sharpened. Then we pin it to money, she replied. Voices fade, transactions persist. They worked in silence, Shadow stationed at the edge of the light, camera rolling when hands moved and stopping when the dark pressed close. Sarah cross-referenced manifests with tied windows, traced exemptions to signatures, mapped a corridor where interference clustered like mold. Jack fed the receiver's recordings into the mix, timestamps anchoring the lies. Outside, the winter sea continued its patient erasure, unaware it had been recruited to betray itself. When they finished, Sarah closed the laptop and exhaled. They'll come looking, she said. Not for you, for me. Jack shook his head. For the evidence, he corrected. Emily straightened. Then we decide where they find it, she said. Shadow rose, tail low and steady, as if agreeing that choices liked witnesses. They separated before dawn. Emily and Jack slipping back into shadow to let the death stand. Sarah disappearing with the numbers folded into places that would not burn. The seabird drifted again, obedient to its lie, while far offshore, confident men slept well. The news traveled the way bad weather did, quiet at first, then everywhere. By morning, Officer Emily Carter, missing at sea, had slipped into briefings and port gossip, its edges smoothed by repetition until it sounded almost respectful. Flags dipped. Forms opened. Men who preferred daylight shook their heads and spoke about storms, and the hunters, believing the sea had kept their secret, stepped into the open to tidy what they thought was finished. Jack Turner watched it unfold from the margin between night and work, where labor pretended not to see and truth learned how to wait. He and Emily had kept the death believable by honoring its rhythms. No calls, no sightings, no heroics. Shadow stayed close. 4-year-old muscle and patience braided together, black and tan coat dulled with salt, so he looked like just another harbor dog when he needed to. They moved through borrowed spaces, empty net sheds, a half-sunk barge, the lee side of a warehouse, places where sound died early and questions learned not to ask. By the second night, the port changed its posture. A container ship eased in after midnight, lights dimmed to a working glow, its hull streaked with rust like old blood. The name on its stern Northwind Grace meant nothing until Sarah Lowell made it mean something, tracing its recent exemptions with the same calm she used to balance accounts that didn't want balancing. Sarah was built for long corridors and longer nights, tall, narrow-shouldered, her charcoal coat hanging straight as a ledger line. Chestnut hair braided tight to keep it from catching on doors. Her hazel eyes were steady behind thin frames, skin pale with winter and fluorescent patience. She spoke softly because she had learned that attention was expensive. They don't hurry when they think the ending is settled, she murmured, tapping a key. That's when patterns forget to hide. Jack angled a small camera toward the berth while Emily adjusted the gain on the receiver she'd learned to trust more than dispatch. Emily moved differently now, still compact, still efficient, but with a careful looseness that came from accepting a truth she'd avoided. The uniform had not protected her. Silence had. Her dark blonde hair was tucked under a knit cap, freckles standing out against skin gone paler from days without sun. When she watched men work, she did it with a gentleness that let them underestimate her. The Northwind Grace offloaded quickly. No announcements. No inspectors who lingered. A forklift carried sealed containers toward a waiting convoy that wore the confidence of familiarity. One man directed traffic with a hand that had signed too many permissions to be nervous. Richard Hale stood apart, immaculate even in the cold silver hair smoothed beneath a tailored coat, scarf folded just so. He spoke into a phone without raising his voice, the way authority did when it expected to be obeyed. Emily's breath fogged once as she recognized the tilt of his head, the way he listened without conceding. "He's confirming," she whispered. Jack adjusted the receiver. Hale's voice slid through, clear as a stamp. "Proceed," he said. "Paperwork is aligned." A second voice answered, Deputy Chief Martin Cole, low and efficient, the consonants clipped by habit. Cole was broad-shouldered with a regulation haircut that made his face look harder than it was, lines etched deep by a career of choosing order over doubt. He had mentored Emily once, praised her diligence, warned her about overreach. Now his voice wore the comfort of a man who believed the ledger would forgive him. "Keep it quiet," Cole said. "No loose ends." Shadow's ears lifted, then flattened for a heartbeat, his gaze fixed on Hale's shoes as if memorizing a scent. Jack let the camera run. He knew better than to chase every word. Men revealed themselves in what they assumed no one would hear. The convoy rolled. A non-profit logo clean, benevolent flashed on a clipboard. Sarah's fingers flew. "That charity," she whispered. "Files perfect returns. Too perfect. Funds in, funds out, never lingering where auditors might ask why." Emily watched the signatures appear on a tablet screen, the stylus moving with a confidence she recognized from training rooms and promotions. "That hand," she said quietly. "I've seen it on expedited clearances." Jack nodded. "Hale," he said, "and Cole's blessing." They followed the convoy at a distance that felt like humility. A security guard glanced their way and saw only a man with a dog and a woman checking a list. Shadow trotted with his tail low and steady, eyes forward, camera hidden beneath his chest, the small device blinking when light fell just right. He looked like a dog waiting for a thrown stick. He was not waiting. At the warehouse, the doors rolled up without ceremony. Inside, fluorescent light flattened everything, turning faces into paperwork. A third man arrived, new to the stage, and Jack marked him immediately. Caleb Price moved with the calm of someone who believed time belonged to him. Tall, narrow-hipped charcoal parka hanging too neatly, hair cut close to wet ash stubble, eyes pale and measuring. He didn't hurry because he didn't expect resistance. He spoke to Hale without smiling, then to Cole without deference. "Insurance closes at dawn," Caleb said. "We'll need confirmation the officer is unrecoverable." Emily's jaw tightened. Jack steadied her with a glance. Hale waved a hand. "The ocean has done its part," he replied. "Let's not reopen doors." Sarah's mouth curved, not with humor, but arithmetic. "There," she breathed, intent. They captured it all. The words that presumed death, the signatures that pretended charity, the choreography that made corruption look like logistics. When the men dispersed, confidence restored, Jack led them away through the maze of pallets and shadows. Dawn thinned the night, a pale rinse that made everything look almost innocent. They didn't celebrate. They consolidated. In a quiet office borrowed from a shipping clerk who believed paperwork was protection, Sarah aligned transactions to voices and voices to times. Emily annotated with the precision of a woman who had learned that clarity was kindness to future juries. Jack labeled files without flourish. Shadow slept with one eye open, chin on his paws, ears ticking when footsteps passed. By afternoon, the rumor had matured into official concern. A press note expressed regret. A search was ongoing. Cole spoke to cameras with a face that practiced sorrow had shaped, offering condolences that sounded like closure. Emily watched from a monitor, unseen, feeling the old anger flare and pass. "He's closing the book," she said. Jack shook his head. "He's indexing it," he replied. Books reopen. That night the hunters came again, not to the sea, but to the evidence they assumed would be fragile. A black SUV idled where it shouldn't. A man with a headset lingered too long near a server rack. Sarah noticed first. "They're checking the locks," she said softly. "Good." Jack repositioned the camera. Emily adjusted the receiver. Shadow stood, body a quiet line between light and dark. The man reached for a cable. Jack let him touch it. Let him believe. The receiver whispered, "Move fast," a voice said Caleb's. "We need the files." Emily caught the timestamp. Sarah caught the account number. Jack caught the breath between the words. When the man left empty-handed, frustration showing for the first time, the trap closed another notch. By midnight, the story had grown teeth. Calls crossed jurisdictions. Numbers refused to reconcile. The nonprofit froze. The convoy stalled. Hale's phone went quiet. Cole's patience thinned. And somewhere beyond the port lights, the winter sea continued to work, indifferent to the names it had been asked to keep. Emily stood at the window and watched snow begin to fall, softening edges without erasing anything that mattered. "They think I'm gone," she said. "They're wrong." Jack rested a hand on Shadow's withers, the dog leaning into the touch with a restrained thump of his tail. "They always are," Jack said. The room smelled of coffee that had gone bitter from being reheated too many times, and the faint ozone of projectors warming themselves to importance. It was an interagency briefing room designed to flatten disagreement-long table, flags placed with equal distance, nameplates aligned like teeth. Men and women filled the chairs with practiced neutrality, coats folded, pens aligned, faces set to listen without committing. Deputy Chief Martin Cole stood near the screen, broad-shouldered and composed, his regulation haircut neat, his jaw set into the lines of a man who believed outcomes justified methods. He was mid-sentence, speaking about ongoing maritime safety concerns, when the door opened without ceremony. Emily Carter stepped in, alive. She did not rush. She did not apologize. At 33, she carried herself with the compact steadiness of someone who had learned how to move on decks that tried to throw her, dark blonde hair pulled back, freckles visible under the harsh lights, blue eyes calm and precise. A murmur rippled. Chairs creaked. A pen clattered. Cole's words died mid-phrase. For a heartbeat, the room forgot how to breathe. Emily took the empty seat at the far end, set a folder on the table, and looked around as if counting witnesses rather than allies. "Before we begin," she said evenly, "I'd like the record to note that I am not deceased." A few people smiled in reflex, others stiffened. Richard Hale sat 2 seats from Cole, immaculate as ever, silver hair smooth, scarf folded like a signature. His expression flickered surprise, masked by professionalism, then settled into a polite concern. He had practiced this face for years. Emily nodded once toward the tech at the back. "Please play the file marked North Wind Grace Audio," she said. Mussaw. Jack Turner stood against the wall, unobtrusive, leather jacket scuffed, red and black flannel showing at the collar, beard trimmed short, hazel eyes alert without challenging anyone directly. He did not belong to the table and made no effort to pretend otherwise. Shadow lay at his feet, 4-year-old German shepherd muscle and patience coiled into a quiet line. Black and tan coat brushed clean, amber eyes half-lidded yet awake. The projector hummed. Hale's voice filled the room, unmistakable in cadence even through distortion. "Proceed. Paperwork is aligned." A second voice followed, Cole's clipped and efficient. "Keep it quiet. No loose ends." Silence fell hard enough to bruise. Emily didn't watch them. She watched the faces around the table as understanding spread like a tide. "Next," she said. The screen shifted to video from Shadow's chest camera. Flashlight beams, boots on deck, hands testing a GPS, casual cruelty spoken like logistics. Someone inhaled sharply. Emily let it play just long enough to settle into the bones. Then she stopped it. "For those who prefer numbers," she said, and nodded to the doorway. Sarah Lowell entered, carrying a slim laptop like a ledger she had decided to read aloud. Tall, narrow-shouldered, charcoal coat straight as a column, chestnut hair braided down her back, hazel eyes precise behind thin frames, Sarah moved with the economy of a woman who had learned to be underestimated and had chosen to keep it that way. Her skin was pale from winter and fluorescent patience. Her voice was soft because attention was expensive. 3 nonprofits, Sarah said, fingers moving. All pristine, all impossible. Funds in and out within 48 hours, routed through ports under Hale's purview, exemptions signed by the same hand. She tapped, and signatures bloomed on the screen. Hale's, Cole's approval codes. A businessman at the table, Calvin Moore, port magnate in his early 60s, heavyset with a tan that defied winter, gold ring catching the light shifted in his seat. Moore had the kind of smile that sold sponsorships and the kind of temper that broke quiet contracts. He opened his mouth. Emily raised a hand. "Please," she said, still polite. "You'll have time." Jack spoke then, voice low and steady, carrying the weight of someone who had learned to speak only when it mattered. "There's more," he said. "Attempts to access and remove files after the presumed death." He nodded to the tech. The receiver's capture played Caleb Price's measured voice. "Move fast. We need the files." The room leaned away from the sound like it burned. A federal prosecutor at the end of the table, Daniel Harper, mid-40s, spare build, receding hairline, eyes tired from nights watching powerful men escape on technicalities, closed his notebook with care. "That's enough," Harper said quietly, standing. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. "Chief Cole, Mr. Hale, Mr. Moore, please remain seated." 2 federal agents appeared as if the room had exhaled them. Hale's face tightened, the practiced concern cracking just enough to show fear. Moore's hand twitched toward his phone and stopped when Shadow rose without sound, body angled, tail low, eyes level, no growl, no bark, just a wall that breathed. Cole's jaw worked once, then stilled. "This is a mistake," Hale said, reaching for calm. "I've served." "You've signed," Harper replied, holding up the warrants. "And tonight, that's enough." Cuffs clicked. Moore protested loudly, voice swelling with indignation that curdled into panic when the agents moved him. Hale went quiet, the way men did when words failed them for the first time. Cole stared at Emily as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "You should have trusted the system," he said. Emily met his gaze. "I did," she replied. "I trusted it to reveal itself." The arrests unfolded with the choreography of inevitability. Outside, red and blue lights painted the snow. Inside, the room felt lighter, as if silence had been carrying a weight no one wanted to name. When it was done, Harper turned to Emily. "You'll be transferred," he said. "State investigations. Protective detail if you want it." Emily shook her head. "Not yet," she replied. "I have something to finish." Harper nodded, understanding without asking. The room emptied. Jack remained by the wall, Shadow at his side. Sarah packed her laptop, the braid at her back a quiet line of resolve. "They used silence like a weapon," Sarah said softly. "It failed." Jack looked at Shadow, who sneezed once, sharp and judgmental, then settled. "Silence works," Jack said. "When it's chosen?" Emily gathered her folder and paused by the door. She turned back, eyes bright with a steadiness that felt earned. "Thank you," she said, not ornate, not loud. Jack nodded. "You listened," he replied. Outside, snow fell with a gentler hand, softening edges without erasing the truth that had finally learned how to speak. Spring did not arrive with ceremony. It thinned the winter instead, easing the iron out of the water until the North Atlantic softened from slate to steel blue and learned how to breathe again. Emily Carter stood on a quiet overlook above the harbor where she had once been counted dead, the wind gentler now, lifting the loose strands of her dark blonde hair from a low ponytail as if the season were curious who she had become. At 33, she looked much the same. Compact, efficient, freckles faint across pale skin, but something had shifted behind her clear blue eyes. The posture that once carried vigilance now carried choice. Her transfer papers lay folded in her coat pocket, crisp and final. Federal investigations, Maritime Corruption Task Force, a ladder that did not ask for silence as payment. Daniel Harper had delivered the news without flourish, his spare frame leaning in a doorway that had learned how to hold truths. Mid-40s, tired eyes that had seen powerful men escape and refused to forget it, Harper wore suits that fit poorly and convictions that fit too well. "You won't be alone," he'd said. Emily had nodded, grateful but unconvinced. Some work demanded solitude to hear what others missed. She turned from the overlook and walked down to the docks where Jack Turner's boat waited in its familiar place, weather-beaten wood carrying the memory of winter like a scar it refused to hide. Jack stood at the stern, tall and broad-shouldered, the leather of his jacket creased by years of use, red and black flannel bright at the cuffs like a stubborn ember. His beard was trimmed short, dark hair cut close at the sides, early silver threading through as if the sea had finally claimed a little ground. He watched the water the way men watched old friends, without expectation, with respect. Shadow lay at the bow, 4-year-old German shepherd muscle arranged into a patient line, black and tan coat glossy in the new light, amber eyes following the wind as if it carried a language he had learned to read. His ears pivoted once, then settled, tail giving a single, restrained thump when Emily approached. Jack glanced back and nodded, a greeting that did not ask anything of her. They stood together for a moment, listening to the harbor do ordinary work lines creaking, gulls arguing, engines coughing awake sounds that meant the world had decided to keep going. "They'll try to write it small," Jack said finally, voice low and steady. "They always do." Emily smiled, not wide, not bitter. "They can try," she replied. "The numbers won't let them." From the pier behind them came the soft click of sensible boots and the whisper of wool. Sarah Lowell approached with her laptop tucked under one arm, charcoal coat straight as a ledger line, chestnut hair braided down her back to keep it out of the way of thinking. Tall and narrow-shouldered, skin pale from winter and fluorescent patience, Sarah moved with the economy of a woman who had learned to be underestimated and had chosen to keep it that way. Her hazel eyes were precise behind thin frames, and when she spoke it was softly, because attention was expensive and truth did not need amplification. "Indictments filed," she said. "Asset freezes held. The charity shells collapsed the way they always do when sunlight learns their names." Jack exhaled slowly. "Good," he said. Emily felt the relief land, not as triumph but alignment. They had not broken the sea. They had listened to it long enough to hear where it lied. Later, when the tide turned, Emily walked the docks one last time as an officer of that place, pausing at the bait shop where winter had taught her how little noise truth required. Linda was there, hair still pinned against time, eyes kind and knowing without needing details. "Glad you're back," Linda said, sliding a coffee across the counter. Emily wrapped her hands around the cup, warmth spreading reluctantly. "Me too," she answered, and meant it. At a distance cameras would never capture, Jack cast off and eased the boat into open water. Emily rowed with him until the harbor mouth widened and the sea took over, Shadow at the bow reading the wind like scripture. They did not talk much. There were things that didn't need words once they had survived being quiet together. When Emily disembarked at the federal dock, Harper waited with a nod that passed for ceremony. She shook Jack's hand firm, brief, and knelt to scratch Shadow behind the ear, the dog leaning into the contact with restrained pleasure. "Good work," she murmured. Shadow sneezed once, sharp and judgmental, then settled as if the matter were closed. Jack watched her go without regret. He had learned the difference between endings and continuations, and this felt like the latter wearing a new coat. Weeks passed. Hearings unfolded. Names that had once been spoken in confident murmurs learned how to sound small. Cole's posture sagged under oath. Hale's smile failed him. Moore's indignation found no purchase where numbers had learned to testify. Sarah testified with calm precision, the braid at her back, a quiet line of resolve, arithmetic doing the work emotion never could. Emily followed the money and the roots beyond the port. Her compact strength carried into rooms where the truth preferred to whisper. And Jack returned to the margins by choice, the boat his address again, the sea his neighbor. On a morning when spring finally admitted itself, he stood at the bow with Shadow and let the wind choose the day's direction. The dog's ears lifted, then angled, then relaxed, verdict delivered. Jack smiled to himself, a small private thing, and steered into the light. There were no speeches, no medals, no headlines that would remember the dog's eyes or the hand that closed a mouth at the right second. There were only ordinary days that felt different because they had been earned. Sometimes miracles did not arrive with thunder. Sometimes they arrived with restraint, with listening, with the courage to speak when silence would have been safer. The sea lay calm, the kind of calm that did not erase what it had been asked to keep, and the truth once given air refused to sink again. Sometimes the miracle is not a wave that parts the sea or a voice that shakes the sky. Sometimes it is quieter than that. Sometimes it is a moment of restraint when fear urges us to speak, a whisper of discernment when lies feel convenient, or a loyal presence, human or animal, that hears danger before it has a name. The Bible reminds us that God often speaks in a still, small voice, not in thunder, but in the quiet that asks us to choose what is right when silence feels safer. In this story, no one walked on water, yet grace was everywhere, in a hand that stopped a word, in a dog that listened when humans could not, and in the courage to tell the truth even when it carried a cost. In our daily lives, we may never face storms at sea or conspiracies in the dark, but we face smaller tests every day. Moments when something feels wrong, when looking away would be easier, when kindness, honesty, or faith requires us to slow down, listen, and act. Those moments matter more than we realize. God uses ordinary people, ordinary choices, and even quiet instincts to protect, to guide, and to bring light where shadows expect to win. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment and write Amen if you believe that miracles, quiet, faithful miracles, still exist. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories of courage, loyalty, and grace. May God watch over you and your loved ones. May He place guardians on your path when danger draws near. May He grant you discernment to recognize truth, courage to stand for it, and peace when the storm finally passes. And may you always remember, even in the calmest sea, God is still listening.